iPhone 14 Pro. And if you've never stumbled upon my channel in the past, then let me just give you a quick heads up that I am a heavy Android user through and through. Not only do I use Android as my primary operating system throughout the year and create videos showcasing Android applications that I love every single month, but I've even made 2 Android exclusive applications with no intention of ever creating iOS versions. But every single year, I choose and purchase one of the newest iPhone models to use for at least a month to then provide insight here on the channel. Now, last year with the iPhone 13 Pro, I actually found my time with it incredibly enjoyable. So much so that I found it really hard switching back to Android afterwards. And so, suffice it to say, I was kind of nervous coming into using the iPhone 14 Pro, as I was worried that it would be even harder switching back this time around. And so, after using it as my one and only device for the past month, I'm finally ready to share my thoughts on it. You ready? Let's dive in. Now, in the interest of saving time, I'm only going to briefly discuss each of the features that are similar between this and last year's devices, and I'm going to save the meat of this review for unpacking all of the really tangible upgrades and downgrades that you'll notice between the two. So that means I don't really need to talk about the display on this phone because, as far as I'm concerned, it is really similar to the fantastic display on last year's 13 Pro, which basically means it's still beautifully fluid thanks to that 120Hz refresh rate. It's incredibly bright, even quite a bit brighter in direct sunlight, which is great. And as always, it's just one of the most responsive and color accurate displays you'll come across on a phone. The design is also almost beat for beat identical to last year's Pro lineup, with the only subtle change being the slightly beefier camera unit on the back, and of course the new cutout at the top of the display, which we'll come back to a little later on. But funnily enough, in the Android world, we've actually started seeing a number of devices being released over the past year that have almost unashamedly borrowed very heavily from the iPhone design language. The key suspect of which was the Nothing Phone 1, which I reviewed last month on the channel. But to be honest, I've always loved this flat edge, flat display iPhone design language, so I was really happy to see it finally being adopted in the Android world. But what this kind of also resulted in was actually me becoming more aware of the flaws associated with how Apple handles this design language. For one, I don't understand why they insist on covering the sides of the phone with this highly glossy material, which not only makes it more slippery and a little more uncomfortable to hold in the hand, but also makes the sides outrageously susceptible to fingerprints. The side-to-side wobble when the phone is lying flat on a table is also quite a bit worse now thanks to that bigger camera hump. And so whilst these are minor points of contention, I do want to mention them in the hope that Apple addresses them in the future. With that being said, the haptics are still absolutely world-class in this phone, which is something that most people take for granted. But by golly, do I appreciate how good they are with this phone, particularly when this is one of the most inconsistent areas when comparing the many devices on offer in the Android world. I will say, I actually think that Samsung and Google have nearly, if not all the way, caught up to Apple in terms of haptic quality with their latest flagship offerings, but that's only a testament to how well Apple have been doing it for so many years, given that it's taken this long for anyone to get even close. One improvement to the haptic experience though is that Apple finally added this little toggle under the Sounds and Haptics menu, allowing users to enable haptic feedback when typing with the default Apple keyboard. This was a sorely overdue but very much appreciated inclusion, and it's actually available on every device running iOS 16 if I'm not mistaken, so if you are using an iPhone running iOS 16, please do me a favor and enable this toggle and you can thank me later. Other hardware related aspects like Face ID and speaker performance, they're all very much the same as the past few generations of iPhones, but I've got to say, I actually love using Face ID every time I come back to using an iPhone device. And I really do wish that Android devices would get on board with this method of authentication. And I'm not talking about that insecure front-facing camera unlocking method. I mean true 3D depth mapping and infrared scanning, because it is just so dang seamless. Yes, we had it back on the Pixel 4 flagship lineup, and I loved it on those phones, but since then, we've never seen it on another Android device, at least not at this quality in terms of how Apple implements it with Face ID. And then we have the cameras, and despite the main sensor being an upgraded 48 megapixel sensor compared to the tried and true 12 megapixel sensor from the past, who knows how many iPhone generations, in real world performance, you can honestly hardly notice the difference. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I raved about the cameras on last year's iPhone 13 Pro, saying that it had the most consistently reliable set of cameras found on any phone released at that point. And I still think the same is true of the iPhone 14 Pro. Each of the three lenses, so the main, the ultra wide, and the telephoto, and in fact, I'll also throw the selfie camera into this conversation, they all just look so shockingly similar in terms of image quality. And it just gives you such confidence to go out, start capturing photos and videos without any hesitation. But if you were expecting any proper, tangible upgrades over the 13 Pro in terms of image quality, well, right now, there's very little difference between the two phones. And I've actually even been seeing quite a number of users complaining about the slightly over-processed and over-sharpened look that you can get from images taken from the main lens. And you know what that reminds me of? It actually gives me strong flashbacks to when last year's Pixel 6 devices were released, both of which also had upgraded 50 megapixel sensors. And wouldn't you know, images from those devices at launch were also looking a little bit over-processed and HDR-y. So I think in time, Apple will start utilizing the upgraded sensors to even better effect through the use of software updates. But as of right now, like I said, the differences are pretty negligible. One tangible benefit to the upgraded sensor though is this new 2x shooting option, which thanks to that upgraded sensor and the fact that Apple still bins its final image resolution down to 12 megapixels when not shooting RAW, essentially means that you can losslessly zoom into a 2 times field of view and still capture a full quality picture. And it's nearly as good as a dedicated 2x telephoto lens. So I have to applaud Apple for their ingenuity here, and I can imagine that a lot of Android manufacturers will follow suit with this sort of functionality in the next year or two. And in fact, Google have just announced this feature with their Pixel 7 lineup, so it's already started happening. The only other real changes in terms of the shooting experience is that we now have the ability to shoot cinematic videos at a 4K resolution, which is a much welcomed improvement. And there's this new action mode, which is supposed to provide you with even more stable footage compared to what the stock sensor shift stabilization provides. At the moment, this mode is capped to a max resolution of 2.8K, and the results can be grainy, even sometimes in good lighting conditions. But I will say, in these extreme sort of running scenarios, the stabilization is actually pretty impressive. So those shortcomings might be worth the extra layer of stability you get from using this mode. But for now, I'll tie up this camera segment like this. If you're looking for really obvious camera upgrades with the iPhone 14 lineup, then unfortunately, that is not the case. But if all you care about is a great set of cameras and you don't care how good or similar it is to the last year's models, well then just know this phone has a fantastic set of cameras, both for capturing photos and for capturing videos. Oh, just one other thing I will mention regarding the cameras is that because of the increase in size to the camera unit, any cases from last year's models will not fit the newer models. And so if you are in the market for a case to keep your brand new iPhone 14 in mint condition, then I can highly recommend picking one up from channel sponsor, RhinoShield. So I've spoken about RhinoShield several times on the channel now, and that's because their cases are, to put it simply, some of the best, and they've just gotten even better thanks to the latest upgrades. For one, they're now easier to take off and put back on. They're also more grippier and easier to clean, but then on top of that, they're also now even more customizable. Along with the new colors, you can also change the camera ring and the buttons. You can also choose from stacks of designs from Dragon Ball to Vincent van Gogh, and in combination with their brand new grip, which is available in both adhesive and MagSafe versions, the chances of you even dropping your phone have become pretty much nil. Oh, and what's really cool is that you can even get the cases now in MagSafe versions. And these actually have twice the magnet strength of Apple's own MagSafe cases. So if you're looking to pick up a case for your brand new iPhone 14 Pro or for a different device, perhaps an older one that you want to breathe some life into, then use the link below. And if you use the code SAM14 at checkout, you can have 20% off their cases in the first week of this video going live. Okay, so I may have spent a little longer chatting about the cameras than I intended to, but from there, I want to now spend quite a bit of time unpacking the biggest changes with the iPhone 14 Pro lineup. The first of which being the battery life. Now, on last year's entire iPhone 13 lineup, but in particular the iPhone 13 Pro and Pro Max, the battery life was staggeringly good. But I don't know whether it's the upgraded chipset, some issues related to software, or perhaps something else, but for one reason or another, the battery life on the iPhone 14 Pro has been noticeably worse than the iPhone 13 Pro. Now, it's still well above the competition in my opinion, and with light use could probably still eke out 2 full days of use, so it's definitely nothing to sneeze at, but it's just surprising to see this being an area that has taken a hit, and it's probably the one reason to consider picking up last year's devices as opposed to this year's. Aside from battery life though, the other differences are all good news. And we'll start with this brand new cutout at the top of the display, which is what Apple famously dubs the dynamic island. By now, pretty much every man and his dog knows or has at least heard of what this feature is, but in short, it was essentially Apple's incredibly creative way of taking what could have been considered a somewhat underwhelming hardware change, being this pretty large cutout at the top of the display, and transforming it into a genius software solution that may just change the way we think about using our phones going forward. And I have honestly loved it. Not only does it genuinely add extra layers of functionality to the phone, in that we can now obviously see information there like music or podcasts or timers, as well as the fact that we can long press it to quickly access card style widgets without having to open the full screen version of the app. But it's the way Apple have implemented it with all of these incredibly fluid and bouncy animations that just make it a true joy to use. Now, will it stay put once Apple finally moves to having everything under the display in like 10 years time? Probably not, but will they milk it for all it's worth until then? Absolutely, and rightly so. I love it. Now, staying with software, with the fairly recent release of iOS 16, this actually brought about a pretty huge range of neat inclusions, some of which are present across all iPhone models, like the new customizable lock screens or editing and unsending iMessages, all of which are really cool features that I've loved using. But one of my favorite new features that is exclusive to the new iPhone 14 Pro devices is the always on display. I'm a huge fan of always on displays and have loved using this feature on Android phones for many, many years, and the lack of an always on display has long been one of my biggest gripes in pretty much every past iPhone review I've made. And so having it here on the iPhone 14 Pro has been amazing. Now, is it the perfect implementation? No. Yes, it has a really smooth animation in and out of the lock screen, which I love, but this is almost identical and, dare I say, even a little less satisfying compared to the phenomenal animations found on Google Pixel phones. And yes, it was a fascinating decision to have the wallpaper stay visible on Apple's always on display, as opposed to completely off like on all Android devices with the feature, but am I complaining about it? No, not at all. I just seriously love that we now have this feature. And I'm willing to bet that Apple will add a toggle to disable the wallpaper on the always on display in a future software update. And given the noise about it, I actually wouldn't be surprised if we see this quite soon. Now, unfortunately, iOS 16 made no improvements to the other areas I've complained about with iOS in the past, namely not being able to customize which apps are allowed to have that time-sensitive notification toggle or not, as well as the app library still being a little bit illogical for quickly accessing apps not on your home screen. And whilst the update did also break some of the previous customizations and automations that I'd set up with iOS 15, there were workarounds for pretty much all of the issues. And in fact, I've been using and loving this highly customized home screen setup on my iPhone 14 Pro that not only looks incredible, but that also automatically switches to this beautiful dark mode setup at night. If you want to see how I pulled this off, then you can check out the mammoth 30-minute in-depth guide covering the entire process, linked up in the cards. But all in all, once I took the time to set up my home screen in the way that I liked, I've actually really enjoyed the iOS 16 software experience. As always, iOS has been incredibly fluid and smooth thanks to all of those lovely animations that we've all come to know and love for years, and it's only gotten better with the iOS 16 update. With all of that being said, however, with the Android 12 update last year, I have to say, Google actually managed to kind of level out the playing field quite dramatically in comparison to iOS. I tweeted about this last month, but in short, up until the Android 12 update, there was a pretty big divide between the two operating systems in terms of overall fluidity, and it was really entirely up to individual app developers to make their apps feel smooth. But with Android 12, Google essentially took the matter into their own hands by implementing system-wide animations that made the entire OS feel much more fluid, and app developers didn't have to do a thing. Every app instantly had these fancy overstretch animations whenever you scrolled too far in an interface. There were also all of these beautifully fluid app opening and closing animations. And the reason I'm telling you all this is that for the very first time in my entire experience of reviewing phones, I no longer felt much of an improvement in terms of fluidity when switching to the iPhone 14 Pro, especially compared to how big of a difference it used to be. Now, this is not a slight on Apple. In fact, far from it. They have long been the pioneers for implementing system-wide animations that impact everything about the OS and not just the settings menu, for example, but it has made me really appreciate how far Android has come. And to be honest, it's only gotten better with Android 13. So whilst it's still an absolute joy to use iOS, particularly on the 120Hz display of the iPhone 13 Pro and 14 Pro devices, I'm thankful that I don't have to sacrifice on fluidity when I switch back to Android following this review. Now, obviously, this doesn't take into consideration the benefit you get with iOS in terms of how iPhones tend to remain mostly bug-free and silky smooth for what seems like much longer periods of time in comparison to most Android devices, not to mention the much longer period of software support you get when using an iPhone device. And in all honesty, both of these factors are huge reasons to consider buying an iPhone over an Android phone, particularly if you're a one new phone every 5 years type of person. But last year, I closed my review of the iPhone 13 Pro with the remark that both Android and iOS are getting closer and closer to the point where transitioning between the two isn't as tricky as it once was. And this year, that is more true than ever before. Have I really enjoyed my time with the iPhone 14 Pro? Absolutely. Do I recommend it? Definitely. But am I sad to be switching back to Android following this review like I was with the 13 Pro last year? In actuality, no, I'm not. And in fact, I'm kind of itching to get back to Android, which is kind of like my second home now. But with that being said, I'm hoping that hearing some thoughts on the iPhone 14 Pro from the perspective of a full-on Android enthusiast has been, at the very least, a little insightful. But as always, let me know your thoughts on the matter down in the comments below. As well as that, don't forget to check out the incredible RhinoShield cases using the first link down in the description and use the code SAM14 at checkout to get 20% off your order for the next week. But aside from that, hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will catch you later.